Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cisco support community. Today, we present a live Ask the Expert event inside Cisco Live and Networkers Virtual. During our event today, our expert will be answering your questions on troubleshooting common firewall issues. My name is Daniel Gerson, and I am the Content Manager for Cisco Live and Networkers Virtual here at Cisco. Our expert joining me today is Corelli Sankar, a firewall engineer based in RTP, and is joining us today from Bangalore, India. Corelli will provide insight on how to troubleshoot Cisco's line of firewall products and help diagnose common problems. Welcome, Corelli.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to briefly outline the format for today's Ask the Expert event. Corelli will start with a short presentation on firewall troubleshooting for the first 25 minutes of the program, and then we will dive into the live question submissions for the remainder of the event. During our live presentation, you may submit a question to be answered by Corelli and a team of technical experts using the submit box on the left side of the console. Simply type your question and press submit. To see the latest questions and answers during today's presentation, be sure to click the refresh button just under the slides. You can scroll up to see previous answers in the Q&A box. The team of technical experts is well versed in Cisco's firewall products, so please start posting your questions now to give us the best chance of answering them. We'll be asking polling questions during this webcast, and we encourage you to participate by answering them. So let's get started with today's event. We'll start out with a polling question for the audience. What's the most common firewall issue that you have encountered in the last few months? Is it A, a basic configuration issue, a latency issue, a translation issue, failover problems, or other? Please take a moment to answer, as this will give Corelli an opportunity to tailor her presentation to your needs. Okay, now let's have a look at these results. So it looks like basic configuration issues seem to be the main issue that folks are having. Now I'd like to hand over the mic to Corelli, who will provide insight on Cisco's firewall troubleshooting.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Corelli Shankar. I go by Corelli. I work at the RTP, North Carolina. I'm a TAC engineer working with the firewall team for about 4 years now with Cisco systems. Today's agenda, I'll be discussing basic firewall configuration, allowing outbound access through the firewall, allowing inbound traffic, addressing latency issues, some translation issues that come up, and replacing a failed unit in a failover pair. Also some translation issues, how to identify them, how to find a fix for them, and how to identify what is causing a high CPU issue on the firewall. Basic firewall configuration. There are very few steps that you need to remember to take a firewall off the shelf and put it into production. You got to remember a firewall needs two interfaces, an inside interface and outside interface. And then remember RTP. I come from Research Triangle Park. RTP, just remember that. Not as Research Triangle Park, but route, translation, and permission. The first step, configure inside interface. Give it a name-if, give an IP address, a security level, and make sure to issue a no shut so the interface shows up when you do a show interface. Configure an outside interface. Give it a name-if. Call it outside. Give it an IP address, a security level, and make sure to issue a no shut. These two steps will initialize two interfaces. And the next thing is the R that we talked in the RTP. It's the route, the default route, a 0000000 route, which will be pointing to your upstream router that will connect you to the internet. Next, we need to do the translation in the RTP. So T stands for translation. So you have your inside network, the 192.168.2.0 network, a /24 network, a global outside one interface. These two lines tell the inside network, all the PCs, servers, and computers on that network to look like the outside interface when they go out to the internet. Next comes the permission. So you need to allow permission for the host to go out. Now, as far as ASA and PIX are concerned, you do not need to configure permission for the hosts to go from a higher security level to lower security level, meaning from inside to outside, you don't have to apply an access list on the interface. But this is not true in case of the FWSM. In case of FWSM, irrespective of the security level, access list is required on the interface for traffic to pass through the firewall. Now again, let's remember route, translation, and permission. Next, we'll talk about allowing inbound traffic when you have a web server or an email server. We need to configure static translation. The one that we talked about earlier in the previous slide is dynamic translation, NAT global. Now we need a static translation to allow inbound traffic. It could either be a static one-to-one NAT or a static PAT. The examples are there on the slide for static NAT as well as static PAT. In addition to configuring the translation, we need to configure permission. So the permission is right there. For the email server, we're allowing anybody on the internet to talk to that particular IP address on port 25, and in case of a web server, it will be port 80. And we need to apply that access list with an access group command on that interface. So that line is access group inbound in interface outside. So that's the basic configuration, allowing inbound as well as outbound access through the firewall. Next, we'll talk about addressing latency issues. Most of the times on the support forum, people always pose questions saying, when I'm outside of the firewall, I can load this airline booking website much quicker than I can load it when I am behind the firewall. Why does that happen? Why is there a latency when I'm on a PC or a laptop behind the firewall? Here are some of the reasons that could cause latency issues when you load a certain website from behind the firewall. So let's investigate, let's address each one of them and see how to identify what is causing the problem. So when you use a PC on the outside of the firewall, does it show the same symptom as it does on a PC behind the firewall? If it doesn't, then we need to look and see what IP address am I using on this PC. Is this different than the IP address that my inside client is looking like when it goes out to the internet? What DNS is this PC on the outside using? Maybe you're using a 4.2.2.2 address for DNS on the PC on the outside. Maybe the laptop, when it is behind the firewall, you're using an internal DNS server's IP address. So we need to look at all of that. And if the PC works fine on the outside with the IP address that you provided, maybe an available IP address that the ISP has given you, you could use the same IP address to translate the inside host and see if that would resolve the issue. We've seen cases where IP address matters. We'll see why that is in the future slides. Whether HTTP inspection is enabled. How do you verify HTTP inspection is enabled? You run that command right there. You ping the website, google.com, get the IP address, and issue that command. Show service policy flow, TCP host 192.168.2.10, where 192.168.2.10 is a PC behind the firewall, and the host 72.163 address may be a Google address or any other website's address that you have trouble loading. And equal to 80 is the HTTP port. So when the output, it'll show you whether HTTP inspection is enabled or not. And if it is enabled, try to see if you can disable HTTP inspection and try to see if the website will load quickly as it does on the outside. So once you remove HTTP inspection, also make sure to issue a clear local for that IP address. The slide there shows clear dash local, but it is clear space local. I'm sorry about that. Now, the next thing to see is whether policing is enabled. Are we throttling? Is this firewall throttling the bandwidth that it allocates for each of the computers behind? Sometimes these firewall or new firewall administrators or an old administrator enable policing, and a new firewall administrator is not aware of that. Is it configured? So how do we know policing is configured? You issue the command that is on this slide there, and that should show you whether policing is enabled. You see that output there. So if it is, just disable policing. So the commands are there on the slide. No police, copy and paste the police line with the no in front of it. But before you do that, you have to get into the policy map, get into the class map, and then issue the no police line. Once you do that, make sure to issue a clear local for the host that you're trying, and try to load the web page again. Now the next thing, make sure there are no content scanning module, a CSC module. You can have a CSC module on an ASA 5510 or 5520 models. You can have N2H2 or WebSense scanning the HTTP traffic. Just for troubleshooting purpose, try to issue those commands: show run URL server, show run filter, see if there is threat detection enabled, show run threat. Try to see if any of those are enabled and get them out of the equation, remove them from the config, and load the website and see if that could be causing the problem. And the main thing, we see most of the cases getting resolved because the interfaces show errors. The main thing, the important thing to find out, verify, is whether the interfaces are running clean. A quick command is show interface type include errors. Issue the command a couple of times, up arrow a couple of times. Make sure the interfaces are running clean. If not, if you see any of those counters, overruns, input errors, collisions, increment, then we need to identify which of your interfaces. You may have an inside, outside, a DMZ1, a DMZ2. We need to identify which of those interfaces is the ones that are showing these errors. You do that by specifying show interface E0 or show interface E1 or show interface gig01, whichever is appropriate. If you do a show IP, it will show you all the interfaces configured and issue a show interface for each of those interfaces and see which one shows these errors. Once you find out which interface it is, then you can see if you can remove the cable and replace that, or if you can move it to another switch port. Make sure the interfaces run clean after. Now the next thing to see is which IP address is able to load the website properly without any latency. The NAT global fails or shows latency, whereas a static one-to-one that you configured for your web server works. So your web server behind the firewall is able to load this website, but a PC or a laptop shows latency. Now, there are reasons for that. Maybe the remote website is not allowing more than a few connections from one IP address. If it is a NAT global, then you probably have 20, 40 computers that look like one IP address trying to access that website, which the website may not allow, right? You can limit the number of connections that an individual IP address can establish to a given web service IP address on the remote end. Maybe that is the problem. If that is the case, unfortunately, we have to configure static one-to-ones if it is an important website that you need to load from behind your firewall. Now, translated addresses sometimes may be denied by the remote website. That's the reason we try to use another available public IP address and see if you can load the same website. If that's the case, obviously the old IP address that you were using is not being allowed by the remote website. In that case, you need to reach out to the remote website's administrator, pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, when I try to access your web page looking like x.x.x.x, I can't load the page or it loads slowly, but if I access your website using y.y.y.y address and I'm able to load it fine. So is that something that you're doing on your end, or what we need to do about it? So once you change your translated address on any firewall, a static one-to-one you want to change or a NAT global address that you want to change, make sure to issue a clear local for the inside host that is in question so it can take the newly translated address when you load the website the next time. Now, the other main issue is we don't see this issue lately because everybody is running an 8.0 code. Even in the 8.0 code, we see this MSS issue. Maybe in the 8.2.2 code, we don't see that because the fix is already in place. The MSS issue. In the normal TCP session, whoever sends this in to the server, the MSS is included in the TCP option of the SYN packet. And the server, upon receipt of the SYN packet, it should recognize what the MSS the client is going to support, and it will also send its own MSS. So they both can agree on what they can receive. Now, with this MSS being a problem, the server does not agree to what the client sends to it and decides to send a larger MSS value or larger packet that the ASA may drop. So this syslog will clearly indicate that that is the problem. If you look on the link that I provided below, it's a very quick fix to allow MSS exceed, and you can put that on the ASA, and that problem should go away. But again, in the most recent code, you should not see this problem. Now, load balancing has been an issue. We've seen this quite a few times, whereby certain IP addresses, the translated IP addresses, among the IP address that your ISP provides you may be able to load a certain website faster than other IP addresses. That's purely because how your ISP load balances based on the source and the destination IP address. Your source may look like A.A.A address, which will be load balanced via different cities, different hubs, and maybe a B.B.B address that your ISP provider may be load balanced across another slew of routers, which may be faster. Now again, some websites, when a remote IP address is trying to access it, will try to verify if that is a legitimate address by doing a reverse lookup on the IP address to make sure it has a name associated with it. Many people have names configured for their web server, for their email server, for their Oracle server, for their application server, but they may not have a name associated with their global address, like a NAT inside 192.168 and the global, whatever the interface address is. That interface address may not have a name associated in the zone file for that company. So when you go out looking like this translated address, like the interface's IP address, the remote website, which may try to do a reverse lookup, may not get a name for IP address, and they may deny you access loading the website. So what do? You pick up the phone, call your ISP, and have them add a name for this IP address in the zone file. So say, for example, global.mycompany.com. So when they do a reverse lookup, it'll have a CNAME, a PTR record to look back, and you can load the website just in case if the remote website wants to make sure the legitimacy of the address that you're going to try to look like. Last but not least, make sure your IP address that you're going to look like on the internet is not registered in the spamhaus.org.
Okay, thanks, Corelli. Let's take a break real quick, and let's go to our second polling question. Which firewall devices do you have installed in your network? Cisco PIX 500 series security appliances, Cisco ASA 5500 series adaptive security appliance, Cisco Catalyst 6500 series firewall service module, a combination of the above, or other. Take a minute and submit your response so Corelli can get a better idea of our audience today. Okay, let's take a look at today's results. Excellent. Looks like Cisco ASA 5500 series is the dominant choice by far. Excellent. Okay, Corelli, let's go back to the presentation.
All right. A lot of times we hear requests from the customer saying, we have a Barracuda server on the DMZ, for example, that receives all the email from the internet, and it does, whatever laundry it has to do, clean it up, and then it will send those emails to the Exchange server that's on the inside. Now, the normal thing is the Exchange server doesn't send the email to Barracuda, and the Barracuda does not send the email to the internet. The Exchange just sends the email directly to the internet. Now the problem here is that the Exchange server does not look like the MX record that the customers expect to. It should look like the MX record, just like the Internet MTAs deliver email to the Barracuda server. So how do we make this happen? So here's a quick thing, very simple. So the existing Barracuda translation is a static path, like you see, static DMZ comma outside for TCP port 25 for the Barracuda server 10.10.0.2 to look like 172.16.12.40. But the Exchange server was taking the NAT global and looking like the interface IP address all along. So that was a problem. Now how do we make that look like what the Barracuda server is receiving email as? So it's a NAT inside 2, give it a different ID, and a global outside 2 to match that, and specify just the Exchange server IP address 192.168.2.30 with a 32-bit mask, and use a global outside 2 172.16.12.40. Again, all these translations are based on 8.2, and these are the same with the FWSM as well. So the 8.3 NAT has been changed completely. So most of the customers are still not on the 8.3. Everybody is on 8.2. So we're not covering 8.3 NAT scenario here. So just in case if people are running 8.3, these commands do not apply for that. I just want to mention that. All right, the next main thing I just want to touch on a little bit about a failover. There have been cases where people replace one of the failed units on a failover pair, and then they panic because the newly replaced unit ends up sending its blank config to the sitting unit, wiping both units' configuration. That's a pretty bad situation. So why does that happen? A typical scenario that I have seen in the forum while I answered a thread is as you see on the screen. The primary unit fails, and we send in an RMA or we file an RMA, and the secondary unit meanwhile takes over as an active unit. So upon receiving the primary unit, they make sure to TFTP the correct code that's on the secondary unit, which is active, and then they copy and paste the failover lines that were on the primary, and they enable failover on the primary unit. Now, the only mistake that they made is they made sure the code is matching, but they did not make sure that the licensing features are the same between the two units. Because failover got enabled here at this point, due to license mismatch, failover gets disabled. Okay, so failover gets disabled meaning no failover on the units. Later, they reach out to Cisco licensing, get the proper licensing added onto the primary unit, and then they enable failover on the primary unit. Now, what they don't recall is that failover was disabled due to licensing mismatch earlier on. So this primary unit says no response from mate. So the failover manually gets disabled. So they disable failover saying, oh my God, I forgot to enable failover on the secondary. So they quickly go back and enable failover on the secondary, and then almost immediately they enable failover on the primary as well. So this situation ends up with the primary unit sending its blank config over to the secondary. Now, the reason is failover was enabled on both units at the same time, and whenever the primary unit in the failover pair comes up, it takes over as the active. So this is expected behavior whereby the blank config from the primary unit that just got replaced gets written on to the secondary unit. Now, how do we avoid this from happening? What do we need to do? So make sure the show version looks identical between the two units, right? That includes license as well as with the code version that it is running. Make sure to issue show fail on the existing unit, whichever is the sitting unit, issue a show fail. Make sure the status that you see is secondary unit active and primary unit failed. It should not say, no failover or any unexpected output for the show fail. Now, what you do, you copy and paste the failover lines onto the unit that you are going to replace. So now it should say failover LAN unit primary. Make sure I have highlighted that in red there. It should not say failover LAN unit secondary because the secondary unit is the sitting unit which is active. Now you copy and paste these lines, and then once those are done, enable failover on the primary unit. The newly enabled primary unit. So once you enable failover on the primary unit, it will automatically detect the existing active unit. The secondary unit is playing the active role. And as you can see there, it will begin configuration replication from its mate. And once that is done, you can issue a show fail, and both units will show you the proper status of what each unit's role is. So now, what's the takeaway from this? Whenever you replace a unit, whether it is primary or secondary, make sure the sitting unit show fail shows this unit active and other unit failed before you introduce another unit and enable failover on it. Also, I should mention here that you should also make sure to issue show-over on both these units before even engaging the replaced unit online, just to make sure the show-over is identical between the two of them. Next. Sometimes we get translation problems. They say this host can't reach that web server, or this host cannot reach the email server, at random times. It works for 4 hours and then it fails, and then we do a clear local for the, the host, and then things start to work fine for another 4 hours. So what's that mystery? Sometimes it's 4 hours, which is the ARP timeout. Sometimes it's like 6 hours, or random times until a clear XLate is issued or a clear local is issued. Things start to work and then fail again. So once they give us a problem and provide us a show tag, which I have shown in the slide here, just the relevant configuration. So the problem here is the host is unable to reach the email server. So the email server lives off of the WAN interface, off of this FWSM, and the host is living off of the inside interface. So now we're going to apply what we learned, RTP, right? Route, translation, and permission. We're going to apply that. So do we have proper routes? Yes, so let's assume we have proper routing in place. Let's assume the translation is no translation is configured. So no translation is configured, meaning any host on the lower security interface can establish communication with the host on a higher security interface without the need for, static translation. So when you do a show XLate debug for this host's IP address, then you say, it's established identity translation, right? It's looking like itself, whichever interface it's going to talk to. So from the inside, the 10.130.6.20, which is the host, tries to talk to the outside interface looking like itself. It also talks to the WAN interface looking like itself. Now, look at the next output, show XLate detail for the email server. It says NAT from test, whereas our picture that we saw in the previous slide, the email server clearly hangs off of the WAN interface. Now this output shows it lives off of the test interface. Obviously, that's the problem. How do we stop this, or how do we find the root cause? Quickly apply this command, IP verify reverse path on that interface. So that should only allow the hosts that belong on that test interface looking at the routing table and not allow any other host. Now, to get to the root cause, we need to apply captures on the test interface, find out why a source packet with the email server is even arriving on the test interface when it is supposed to arrive on the WAN interface. And we can, with the captures, we can see what the destination is, and then we can query the router why the routing was configured or misconfigured for the packet to show up on the wrong interface. Now, the last one is how to identify what is causing high CPU. Once you open a tag case, we collect a show proc output a couple of minutes apart, and we take a diff on that, and we can tell you what the CPU is doing at the time of the problem. The common things that cause high CPU are listed here on the slide. And this is a very handy command, the show local pipe include host count limit. This will tell you, give you that nice little output about all the hosts that have established how many TCP, UDP, or embryonic connections. So if you see one host establishing too many TCP or UDP connections, then you can go to that computer and see why maybe they are infected, maybe they have adware, spyware, something there, and you can clean it up, or you can disconnect that from the network and do a good cleanup. And how to collect captures. You can throw in a capture on the interface, see what traffic the firewall sees, and then maybe it is a layer 2 loop. If so, you could very well identify by means of captures. And inspections could cause high CPU. If you do a show service policy, you can see how many inspections are configured, and if you don't need all of those inspections, you can remove them. And the Syslog service is not running on a Syslog server. It's the major thing. If the Syslog service is not running on the Syslog server, the ASA may continue to send Syslog messages, but the Syslog server may send a port unreachable message back to the ASA that may be converted as another Syslog and sent back to the Syslog server, which may cause Syslogs to increase exponentially, causing high CPU. And last but not least, if you've analyzed and looked at all of these other options, then probably you just need to upgrade the piece of hardware. And that's all the items that I had to discuss today. Maybe in the future we can discuss other problems that everybody encounters on a daily basis in a networking environment. Thank you, and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Corelli. Before we move into the Q&A portion, let's go to our last polling question. Which security topics would you like to see in a future webcast? More on firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, VPN, physical security, or other? Go ahead and take a moment and answer. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, folks would like to see more on VPN. We can definitely take down that note and look at that for future webinars. Okay, moving on. Now it's time to answer some of the questions our viewers have submitted today. By the way, if you can't stay with us for the discussion, be sure to click on the evaluation button to let us know how this session met your business needs and expectations. The first 10 listeners to complete the evaluation will receive a $20 Amazon gift card. Let's move into the Q&A portion now. And so Corelli can start to answer some of the questions that you have submitted today. Okay, let's pull out a question here. You can still submit questions at any time, so please go ahead and do so if you haven't already. Okay, we have a question on commands here. Between these two commands, failover interface IP failover and failover interface IP state, what is the difference between those two commands?
One is for interface and one is for stateful. So stateful meaning the state, the TCP state will get updated, replicated between the two units over the state link. Sometimes we use the same interface for both the failover interface as well as failover state. If the state is not configured, then if a failover occurs, all the TCP sessions and UDP sessions have to be established from scratch.
Okay. Let's move to another question. Running FWSM version 4.08, we have a scheduled failover test coming up. Occasionally, in the past, failover worked, but sessions would not establish after the failover until a clear xlate was performed. Is 4.08 affected by this issue? That is, will we have to clear xlate after each failover?
No, you should not have to issue a clear xlate after a failover. Is this 408? Dan, I'm not able.
It's 4.0 revision 8.
Revision 8. I have not run into any known defects that would require a clear xlate, but this should not be required. Failover should be very smooth, and if you configure stateful failover, you do not have to clear xlate and establish connections again. It should be seamless. Nobody should even know that a failover event has occurred.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next question. How can we configure NAT on ASA 8.3 to allow redundant or backup ISP links configuration?
The redundant ISP configuration is the iOS supports that as well. So we can do, I'm not sure if you're talking about redundant interface or two different ISPs. In any case, we do not support two default routes out two different interfaces. We have to use a router and use that router to fall back and forth between the two ISP links.
Okay.
Next.
Let's go to the next question. I'm trying to set up two pairs of ASA 5510s, which they will both be set up as active standby. The failover interfaces will be connected via Ethernet to the same switch. Do the interfaces need to be on separate individual VLANs on the switch to work properly, or do they only need to be on different IP subnets?
A separate VLAN. The failover interfaces has to be layer 2 adjacent. And it is also, you don't want the failover traffic to go on your regular interfaces and other VLANs. So it is better if you carve out a separate VLAN on your switch and connect these failover interfaces on that particular VLAN.
Okay, next question. How can we enable SSH on ASA?
There are a few steps that are involved configuring an ASA for SSH. So we have to first generate an RSA key pair, and then we just have to issue SSH space the IP address and space the name of the interface. And once that is done, we can create a local user ID, a local like a username Cisco, password Cisco, privilege, whatever, and you can configure AAA for local authentication. Once done, you can SSH to the ASA.
Okay, next question. How can we save the self-signed certificate generated by FWSM on the secondary unit of the failover pair? The write memory command will save the certificate only to the primary unit. How can this be done on the secondary unit?
Is this about the RSA key pair that is generated on the primary? That should get replicated over to the secondary. If it is not, upon failover, if you're unable to SSH and you have to create a new RSA key pair on that, then it is probably a known defect which we have heard of. You probably have to upgrade the code on the FWSM.
Okay, next question. I have configured two Cisco ASA 5500 firewall in active standby. Both the firewall are connected back-to-back. Both the firewalls are running software version 7.2.3. Below are the details. The problem, I am able to telnet the active firewall but not the secondary firewall. It prompts me for username and password, but I cannot give the credentials.
I'm not sure what sort of authentication this is, and maybe this is some sort of ACS authentication, and maybe the ACS server is a couple of hops away, and maybe you are using dynamic routing protocols, in which case you can the routes only appear on the active unit and not on the standby unit. You could probably configure a static route to the ACS server, and then you may be able to telnet to the standby and give the user ID and password.
Okay, we have another question here. I have two ASA 5510s, identical configs. I am having speed issues with one, so I unplugged it and plugged in the second one. The second one is much faster than the first. Why is one ASA faster than the other?
Maybe there is a speed and duplex mismatch in one of the interfaces. We really have to look at that, show interface command, and see what the negotiated speed and duplex is. Maybe one is different than the other. That could cause this. And also make sure the interfaces do not log any errors. Maybe the interface on one of the ASA is really bad and probably needs replaced.
Okay, next question. Why do my VPN tunnels drop at random times? Some stay up for 20 days, and others fail in 15 minutes. I'm using an ASA 5505.
I'm really not sure on that one. Usually the lifetime is default unless you set that 18, I can't remember the number top of my head. but it shouldn't drop. If the interesting traffic is there, the tunnel should stay up. Maybe you have to open a VPN case to address this problem.
Sounds like good advice. Okay, next question. Does the ASA 5505 and 5510 support DMVPN with SR520?
I'm not sure if a 5505 supports DMVPN. It does not. Then no is the answer.
Okay. Another question here. I have a SIP inspection fail on ASA intermittently. What can I do?
We really need to look at logs. For any problem through the firewall, we definitely need logs. In case of SIP skinny voice protocols, we also need the SIP debugs and captures as well. If inspection fails, then we definitely need to collect the logs at that time of the problem. Enable buffer logging debug, logging buffer debug, and do a show log pipe include for that IP address in question and see what sort of logs the ASA is logging. If it is inspection related, then it probably is a known defect in the code that you're running. If you could post the output of the logs on our forum, we'll be more than happy to answer that and investigate that further.
Excellent. Okay, let's go to the next question. Is there a quick reference guide to the differences between the 3.1x train and the 4.x train of the FWSM?
There isn't a quick reference guide just for the differences. The main thing to read about the new features, the best place to go to is the release note. I've included some useful links in the PowerPoint presentation. So if you can download the PowerPoint presentation towards the end, I've included useful ASA links, useful FWSM links as well. If you go to the FWSM documentation link, you will find the release note link, and you can read up on the release note for 3.1 as well as 4.0 to see what new features have been added in both those trains.
Okay, next question. Am I right to say that ASA 5500 only can have one outside interface?
No. There are customers who have both the DMZs public-facing, internet-facing, and outside is also internet-facing. You could have two interfaces internet-facing, but you can only have one default route, meaning all 0 routes pointing towards one interface only. If I may continue on that, if you need to load balance between two ISPs, like the previous question was, that we need to do SLA route tracking between the two. Next question.
Okay. Here's a good one. Our company recently got hit with a virus, and the infected PCs were sending data to the internet. How can we stop this immediately on the firewall and identify the infected PCs by looking at the firewall log?
Excellent. We did come across that command in the presentation. It's a show local pipe include host pipe count /limit command that I showed you in the high CPU section. If you can issue that command, it will show you individual IP addresses on the inside of the firewall as to how many TCP connections and UDP connections they have established to the internet. And you can, go to that PC and see what's wrong with that, or just disconnect that from the network and clean it up.
Sounds like good advice. Okay, we have another question here. Can reserved addresses be configured in the DHCP scope on the DHCP server on the ASA?
Yes. What you can do is if there are reserved addresses, you can configure the scope starting from 10 to 20 and skip over 20 to 30 and then use the rest of them.
Okay, we have another question here. We set up our ASAs via CLI and plan to implement CSM to manage the firewall and VPNs. Are there any issues or reasons we should not use the CSM?
No, I don't see any reason not to use CSM. People use CSM mainly because a lot of people are involved in making access list changes and minor configuration changes who work on a shift basis and who do not have privilege 15 access to make all changes on the firewall. And also with CSM, whatever changes you want to do, it can also be put in as a request and approved upon which the change can be implemented on the firewall. So it's a good thing. It does config archives, and if there is a problem, you can roll back a config, all of that good stuff, part of CSM. But bear in mind, once you start managing a device with CSM, always make changes only from CSM. Do not jump in and make changes on CLI, or upon next run from CSM, the changes that you made via CLI will be undone, considering that as out-of-band changes.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Is it possible to have two inside interfaces on the same subnet on ASA 5505 or 5510?
Meaning inside 1 and inside 2? Yes, certainly. On the same subnet? No. It has to be on a different subnet.
Okay, here's a question on one of the commands from the presentation. What would be considered an excessive amount of TCP connections using the show local, sorry, I have a hard time reading it, show local
that's fine.
host count limit? Yep.
Yeah, so what is normal, that actually is a question that I would be asking you. So if you were a small company with a web server, maybe the web server may have like 40 to 50 connections. If you're a big company, a bigger enterprise, eBay, PayPal, or huge ones, they may have thousands of connections. So for some people, 200 to 300 may be too much. They say, oh my God, my web server has got 300 connections. Well, usually it doesn't have that many connections. So it really depends on the size of the network and what is normal to the web server or the email server. If you see 400 for a small size 50, 40 user network, I would say that is a lot. And embryonic counts, if that goes up 200, 300, clearly there's some sort of malicious traffic that is going on there.
Okay, next question. Is there any way to forward Windows password expiration warnings through the VPN users on an ASA?
I'm really not sure on that one. I can double check on that and answer the question as soon as I find out.
Okay, and you can always check back in the support forums pages. Corelli will be answering questions there over the next 2 weeks. Let's go to another question here. Is there a link on upgrading the FWSM firmware from 3.16 to 3.118, and how disruptive is this?
Not at all. Yes, there is a link how to upgrade the firmware. It's very simple. What you need to do is copy, download the image, put it on your TFTP server, copy TFTP /image on both the units if this is a failover pair, reload the active unit so the standby unit will become active in that case, and then once this new unit comes up, you can move the active as the newly upgraded unit, and you can reload the other unit if it is a failover pair. If it's just a single unit, then you just issue write mem and reload. And since you're staying in 3.1, it cannot be disruptive at all. It should go very smoothly.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Currently using an ASA 5505, when copying a config from TFTP to startup config, is startup config merged with the TFTP config, like when using a PIX with 6.3, or is the startup config overwritten completely?
It gets overwritten completely. Only when you copy it to the running config, it merges. Once you copy it to the startup, then the startup gets overwritten. And once you reload it, it'll reload to the config that you moved from TFTP.
Okay, thank you, Corelli.
Thank you, Dan.
As you can see, there's a few links that we've pushed out for both the ASA and for the FWSM.
Mm-hmm.
So folks can see that. If you have additional questions, log on to the Cisco Support Community URL. You can see that URL here. Corelli will be continuing to answer your questions in the community site over the next 2 weeks. Before you sign off, please do take a few minutes to complete the evaluation of today's session. This will help us address your business needs in the future. We hope you enjoyed the Cisco Support Community Live Ask the Expert event and Cisco Live and Networkers Virtual. We encourage you to explore the virtual environment, including the Cisco and partner booths and the World of Solutions, the on-demand technical sessions in the session catalog, and the blog center. If you missed Cisco Live Las Vegas a few weeks ago, over 150 webcast sessions from that event are now live in the session catalog, along with over 400 PDFs. If you're looking for on-demand video, you can check out all the keynotes as well as the panels and sessions. Also, if you've not explored the Cisco Support Community, please take a moment to see all this program has to offer at https://supportforums.cisco.com. Thank you to our expert, Corelli, for sharing her expertise today, and we wish you a great day.
Thank you.